The storm that broke over Oakhaven County that August night in 1945 felt like the last battle of a war that was already over. If our mission to keep these memories alive resonates with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to ensure you never miss a story. And if you already stand with Agnes, leave a "Stay strong, Agnes" in the comments below. The storm was a violent, angry thing, a tempest of thunder that rattled the window panes of Agnes Miller's small farmhouse and lightning that tore the sky into jagged, brilliant pieces. Agnes sat alone at her kitchen table, a single kerosene lamp casting a warm, trembling circle of light in the heart of the darkness. The storm didn't frighten her. After the telegram that had arrived the previous winter, the one that had neatly and officially cleaved her life in two, there was very little left in the world that could truly frighten her. Her husband, Daniel, had loved storms. He would stand on the porch, his face turned up to the wind and the rain, a wide grin on his face, and say it was the sound of God clearing his throat. But Daniel was gone now, his body buried somewhere in the frozen mud of the Ardennes, his grin just a ghost in her memory. Now, the farm was hers alone. It was a small, stubborn piece of land that her family had worked for 3 generations, a place of hard soil and meager yields. Since Daniel's death, it had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The relentless cycle of chores, the milking, the mending, the weeding, was a kind of penance, a way to fill the vast, echoing emptiness of her days. She was a war widow, a title the townspeople spoke with a mixture of pity and respect, but it was a title that left her utterly, profoundly alone. The farm was isolated, set a good 2 miles from the main road, and that isolation, once a source of peace, now felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The storm raged for hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The thunder grumbled its way east, and a profound, dripping silence settled over the farm, broken only by the frantic chorus of tree frogs. Agnes waited until the first pale, grey light of dawn began to seep over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Then she pulled on her worn work boots and went outside to inspect the damage. The air was cool and washed clean, smelling of wet earth and pine. A few large branches had been torn from the old oak tree by the fence line, and a section of her vegetable garden was flattened, but the house and the barn seemed to have weathered the assault. It was as she approached the barn that she saw it. The large, heavy door, which she had barred herself the previous evening, was slightly ajar. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Her first thought was of a stray animal, a coyote or a fox, seeking shelter from the storm's fury. She picked up a heavy piece of fallen oak, her makeshift club, and pushed the door open, peering into the gloom within. The barn smelled of hay, manure, and the metallic scent of the recent rain. For a moment, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. The familiar shapes of the milking stall, the stacked hay bales, the harnesses hanging from wooden pegs. Then, a low moan from the far corner, near the hayloft ladder, made her freeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was not an animal. She crept forward, her boots silent on the packed dirt floor, and then she saw him. He was collapsed in a heap on a pile of old burlap sacks, a dark shape in the dim light. As her eyes adjusted, the details emerged, each one a new shock to her system. He was a man, a soldier, his uniform torn and caked with mud, and he was a Negro. His face was turned away from her, but she could see a dark, ugly gash on the side of his head, his hair matted with blood. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He was not just hurt, he was broken. Agnes's first instinct was pure, unadulterated fear. A strange man in her barn was dangerous enough. A strange black man, a soldier who was clearly in some kind of desperate trouble, was a catastrophe. This was Oakhaven County, Virginia. She knew the unwritten laws that governed this place better than she knew the commandments. They were laws of separation, of suspicion, of a brutal and swift justice that was meted out long before any real judge was involved. To be found with this man, to be connected to him in any way, would be ruinous. It would mean the loss of her reputation, the scorn of her neighbors, the dangerous attention of Sheriff Blevins, a man known for his cruel efficiency. It could mean the loss of her farm, her home, everything she had left in the world. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to close the door, walk back to the house, and pretend she had seen nothing, or better yet, to drive into town and report what she had found. Let the sheriff handle it. Let the authorities take him away. It was not her problem. He was a stranger and she owed him nothing. She took a step back, her mind screaming at her to flee, to save herself. But as she moved, the man moaned again, a sound of pure, helpless agony, and tried to shift his weight, his face turning toward her. His eyes fluttered open. For just a second, his gaze met hers. There was no menace in his eyes, no threat. There was only a universe of pain, exhaustion, and a desperate animal fear. He was young, not much older than Daniel had been, and beneath the dirt and the blood, she saw the uniform. The same rough wool, the same brass buttons, the same insignia of a soldier of the United States Army. It was the uniform her husband had worn when he left, the uniform he had died in. In that moment, the man ceased to be a threat, a problem, a racial category. He was just a soldier, a broken soldier, a long way from home, who had ended up in her barn, at her mercy. And Daniel's face, his laughing, loving face, rose in her mind, as clear as if he were standing beside her. What would Daniel have done? He would not have hesitated. He would not have considered the risk. He would have seen a brother in arms, a man in need, and he would have acted. To turn this man away would be to betray the very memory of the man she had loved. It would be a second, deeper kind of widowhood. The decision was made not in her head, but in her heart. It was a quiet, terrifying act of rebellion against a world she had always passively accepted. She dropped the oak branch. It landed on the dirt floor with a soft thud. The man flinched, his eyes squeezing shut, expecting a blow. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She knelt beside him, the smell of his sweat and his blood sharp in her nostrils. "Can you talk? What's your name?" His lips moved, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He was severely dehydrated. "Don't try to talk," she said, her voice taking on a practical, commanding tone she didn't know she possessed. "We need to get you inside." Getting him to the house was a monumental struggle. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and every movement seemed to cause him excruciating pain. She half lifted, half dragged him, his arm draped over her shoulders, her own body straining with the effort. They moved in a slow, agonizing shuffle across the 50 yards of open ground between the barn and the farmhouse. Every second, she expected to hear the sound of a truck on the road, to see a pair of headlights cresting the hill. The world felt hostile, filled with watching eyes, but they made it. She guided him through the back door and into the spare room, the room that had been Daniel's, the room she had kept exactly as he had left it. She helped him onto the bed, the clean patchwork quilt, a stark contrast to his filthy, torn uniform. His leg was clearly broken, the bone jutting grotesquely against the fabric of his trousers. The gash on his head was deep and would need stitches. She was no doctor, but she was a farm woman. She knew how to set a chicken's wing, how to stitch a wound on a cow. She would have to make do. For the next 2 hours, she worked with a focused, frantic energy. She fetched water, tore clean sheets for bandages, and found the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. She gently cut away the fabric of his trouser leg, her stomach churning at the sight of the wound. She cleaned the gash on his head as he drifted in and out of consciousness, his muttering a low, incoherent stream of words. She forced a little water between his lips. When she was done, he had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. The broken leg was crudely splintered and bound. His head was wrapped in a clean white bandage. She had taken off his muddy boots and covered him with a fresh blanket. He looked almost peaceful. He looked like a young man again, not a fugitive. Agnes stood in the doorway of the room, her body aching, her hands stained with his blood. The morning sun was now streaming through the kitchen window. A new day had begun. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was harboring a fugitive. She had invited the entire weight of the world's trouble into her home, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the world would soon come looking for him. The only question was when. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright, the sun washing the landscape in a sharp, unforgiving light. For Agnes, the familiar world of her farm had transformed overnight into a place of acute and terrible danger. Every sound was magnified, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The lowing of her milk cow in the barn sounded like an alarm. The crow of the rooster felt like a proclamation of her guilt. She went about her morning chores with a mechanical, practiced efficiency, but her mind was a battlefield of fear and second-guessing. Her hands were steady as she worked the cow's udders, but her gaze kept darting to the dirt road that led to her property, searching for the telltale plume of dust that would signal an approaching vehicle. The man in Daniel's bed was a secret that seemed to radiate from the house, a secret she was sure could be seen from miles away. After she had tended to him, she had spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, sitting bolt upright in a hard-backed chair, her ears straining for any sound from his room, from the world outside. Sleep was an impossible luxury. She had made a decision in the pre-dawn gloom of the barn, a decision born of grief and a deep, abiding sense of rightness. But in the clear light of day, that decision felt reckless, insane. She was a lone woman, a widow, with no one to protect her. She had willingly taken on a burden that could crush her. She finished in the barn, her bucket heavy with warm, frothy milk, and hurried back to the house. The silence within was unnerving. She crept to the door of the spare room and listened. She could hear his breathing, still shallow, but more regular now. Pushing the door open a crack, she saw that he was awake. His eyes were open, and he was staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, his expression a mixture of confusion and pain. He turned his head slowly as she entered, his body tensing, his hand instinctively moving to his side, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "It's just me," she said softly, keeping her distance to avoid frightening him. "I'm the one who found you in the barn." She placed a glass of water on the nightstand beside the bed. "You were in a bad way. You need to drink this." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes dark and filled with a feverish light, assessing her. He was trying to piece together the events that had brought him here, to this clean, quiet room, under the care of this strange white woman. He slowly, painfully pushed himself up on his elbows. Where am I?" he asked, his voice a dry, hoarse whisper. "My farm," she replied. "Oakhaven County. You're safe for now." "Safe," he repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. He drank the water greedily, his throat working. He sank back against the pillows, exhausted by the small effort. "My leg. It's broken," she said, her tone practical, matter-of-fact. "I've done what I can to set it, but it's a bad break, and the gash on your head needed cleaning. You've lost a fair amount of blood." He closed his eyes, a flicker of pain or memory crossing his features. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, the words of politeness sounding strange and formal in the intimacy of the sick room. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said simply. "What's your name, soldier?" "Caleb," he said. "Corporal Caleb Freeman." "Well, Corporal Caleb Freeman," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I'm Agnes Miller, and you have found yourself in a whole world of trouble." Over the next hour, as she spoon-fed him some thin broth she had made, the story came out, not in a flood, but in broken, painful fragments, punctuated by long silences as he fought against the pain and the fever. He was stationed at a training base less than 100 miles away. He had been accused of striking a white officer, a lieutenant who had been tormenting him and the other black soldiers in his unit for months. The accusation was a lie, a carefully constructed trap. He hadn't struck the man. He had simply refused an order to perform a humiliating personal task for the officer on his own time. For this act of quiet defiance, he had been court-martialed. He knew what the verdict would be. He had seen it happen to others. It would be his word against a white officer's. He was facing years in a military prison, a place he had heard was worse than any battlefield. So he had run. He had escaped from the stockade the night of the storm, using the chaos of the wind and the rain as cover. He had made it to a road and jumped onto the back of a slow-moving supply truck, but he had been seen. A guard had fired a shot, and in his haste to jump from the moving truck, he had fallen badly, breaking his leg and hitting his head. He had crawled for what felt like miles through the woods, the storm raging around him, until he had seen the dark, welcoming shape of her barn and had collapsed inside. As she listened, Agnes's heart grew cold with a new kind of fear. This was worse than she had imagined. He was not just a fugitive, he was an escapee from military justice. The army would be looking for him, and they would not be gentle when they found him. They would see him not as a man, but as a piece of runaway property, and they would see her as a thief. She knew what she had to do. She took his torn, muddy uniform, bundled it up, and carried it out to the small incinerator barrel behind the house. With trembling hands, she lit a match and dropped it in. The wool was damp and smoldered at first, giving off an acrid, guilty smell before it finally caught. The flames consuming the evidence of his identity, the symbol of his service and his persecution. As she watched the uniform burn, she knew she was burning her own bridges, severing her last ties to a safe and respectable life. She was a conspirator now. Her fate was tied to his. She was in the kitchen washing her hands, scrubbing away the smell of smoke and the imaginary stain of her crime when she heard it. It was a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, the sound of an automobile engine, loud and getting closer. It was coming up her road. She flew to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It was a black Ford sedan, and the glint of the badge on its side was unmistakable. The sheriff. "They're here!" she breathed, a wave of pure panic washing over her. She ran to the spare room. Caleb was struggling to sit up, his face pale, his eyes wide with the same terror she felt. He had heard it too. "Get under the bed," she hissed, but one look at his splintered, broken leg told her the idea was impossible. There was no time to hide him, no place to put him. He was trapped. They were trapped. The car door slammed shut outside. A moment later, a heavy, authoritative knock rattled her front door. It was a knock that did not ask for permission, but demanded entry. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Caleb, her voice barely audible. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She pulled the door to his room almost completely shut, leaving only a tiny crack. She took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothed the front of her apron with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and walked through the house. She composed her features into a mask of placid, slightly weary neutrality, the face of a grieving widow who was not to be disturbed. Then she opened the door. Sheriff Blevins stood on her porch. He was a big man, his bulk filling out his khaki uniform, his face florid and beefy under the brim of his hat. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of mock respect for her status as a widow, but his eyes, small and shrewd, missed nothing. "Morning, Agnes," he said, his voice a folksy drawl that did nothing to conceal its underlying authority. "Sorry to disturb you so early." "Sheriff," she said, her own voice a marvel of calm. "What can I do for you?" "Just making the rounds," he said, his eyes scanning the yard behind her, lingering for a second on the barn. "We had a bit of a blow last night, checking to make sure folks are all right out this way. You have any damage?" "A few branches down is all," she said, keeping her body framed in the doorway, blocking his view of the interior. "The house and barn are sound." "Good, good," he said, still not getting to the point. He rocked back on his heels. "A woman all alone out here, can't be too careful. Things go missing in a storm sometimes. Livestock, equipment." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "Or people." Agnes's heart skipped a beat. "People? Got a call from the army base over in Blackston," he said, his voice casual, conversational. "Seems they had a prisoner escape last night. A colored boy. Dangerous fella, they say. Struck a white officer. They think he might have headed this way. You haven't seen anyone, have you? A stranger, maybe looking for shelter from the storm?" She held his gaze, her mind a whirlwind, searching for the right words, the right tone. Her entire future and the life of the man in the next room hung on the next few seconds. She gave a small, tired laugh. "Sheriff, the only living soul I've seen in the last 2 days is my milk cow, and she offers precious little in the way of conversation." Blevins chuckled, but his eyes didn't smile. "Well, you keep your doors locked all the same. If you see anything at all out of the ordinary, you call me. You understand? We can't have his kind running loose, upsetting decent folk." "I will, Sheriff," she said. "Thank you for your concern." He seemed about to leave. He put his hat back on his head, but then he hesitated, his eyes narrowing again. He sniffed the air. "Is that smoke I smell, Agnes?" The incinerator, the uniform. Her blood ran cold. "I was just burning some trash this morning, Sheriff," she said, her voice miraculously even. "The storm knocked over the barrel. I was just cleaning up the mess." He stared at her for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. He was weighing her words, searching her face for any flicker of deceit. She held her breath, convinced he could hear the frantic pounding of her heart. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right then, you have a good day now, you hear?" "You too, Sheriff," she said. He turned and walked back to his car. She didn't close the door. She stood and watched him until his car had disappeared down the long dirt road, until the dust had settled, until the only sound was the chirping of the birds. Only then did she step back inside and close the door, leaning her full weight against it, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The knock had come. Her life as she had known it was over, and a new, terrifying life had just begun. The moment the sound of the sheriff's car faded, the carefully constructed dam of Agnes's composure broke, and a tidal wave of trembling relief and sheer terror washed over her. She slid down the back of the door until she was sitting on the cool linoleum of her kitchen floor, her head buried in her hands. She had lied to the law. She had looked Sheriff Blevins, a man who could ruin her with a word, directly in the eye, and had deceived him. The audacity of her own actions was stunning. She was no longer just a woman who had given shelter to a man in need. She was a criminal, an accomplice. After a few minutes, the shaking subsided, replaced by a cold, clear-headed sense of the reality of her situation. Blevins was gone, but he was not satisfied. She had seen it in his eyes. His visit was not a courtesy call, it was a warning shot. He suspected something, the smell of smoke, her isolation, perhaps some flicker in her own expression that she hadn't been able to control. Whatever it was, she was now on his radar. He would be back, and the next time, he would not be so polite. She pushed herself to her feet. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She had to think, to plan. She was no longer just a caregiver. She was a strategist in a silent, deadly war. Her farm, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a potential trap. She went back to Caleb's room. He was sitting up, his face pale and slick with a feverish sweat, his eyes wide with the strain of having overheard the entire exchange. "I heard," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper. "He knows, or he will soon. You have to get me out of here, Ma'am. I'm putting you in a terrible danger." "And where exactly do you think you're going to go with a broken leg and a fever?" she countered, her voice sharp with a fear that came out sounding like anger. "You wouldn't make it to the fence line before they found you. You're staying right here. But the sheriff, I handled the sheriff once. I'll handle him again," she said, with a confidence she did not feel. "What we need to do is make sure that if he comes back, he finds nothing." The house itself was too exposed. The spare room was the first place anyone would look. The barn was no better. It was the place she had found him, and likely the first place Blevins would search. She needed somewhere else, a place that was not obvious, a place where a man could disappear. Her mind raced through the layout of the farm, every building, every closet, every corner, and then it came to her. The root cellar. It was an old stone-lined pit beneath the kitchen floor, accessible only by a heavy trap door that was usually hidden beneath a large rag rug. Her grandfather had built it a generation ago. It was cool and dark and dry, the perfect place to store potatoes and preserves through the winter, and perhaps the perfect place to hide a man. The trap door was heavy, the iron ring cold to the touch. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it open, revealing a set of steep wooden steps leading down into the darkness. A cool, earthy smell rose from the opening. It wasn't a pleasant place, but it was hidden. Moving Caleb was a nightmare. His leg was a source of excruciating, blinding pain. Every jostle, every shift of his weight made him cry out, his voice a strangled gasp that he tried to muffle in his fist. Agnes, her own body aching with the strain, was relentless. She half carried, half dragged him from the bed, across the kitchen floor, and to the top of the cellar stairs. "I can't," he gasped, his body trembling with pain and fever. "I can't make it down there." "You have to," she said, her voice a low, fierce command. "There is no other way. I'll go first. You slide. I'll guide you." It was a slow, agonizing descent into the earth. Agnes went down backward, her arms wrapped around Caleb's chest, taking his weight as he slowly, painfully, slid down the steps on his back, his splintered leg held out stiffly before him. By the time they reached the dirt floor of the cellar, they were both drenched in sweat, their breathing ragged. The cellar was small and cramped, the stone walls damp to the touch. Shelves filled with dusty mason jars lined the walls. Agnes had prepared as best she could. She had brought down a mattress from the attic, a bucket for a toilet, and a stack of blankets. It was a tomb, a prison cell, but it was their only hope. She got him settled on the mattress, his face beaded with sweat, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. She gave him 2 aspirin from a bottle she'd brought down, and another glass of water. "I'll be back as soon as it's dark," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I'll bring food and change your bandages. I'll leave the trapdoor open just a crack for air, but you cannot make a sound. Do you understand me, Caleb? Not a whisper. He might come back. He might be watching the house right now." Caleb just nodded, his face a grey mask of suffering. Agnes climbed the stairs, her heart heavy with a new kind of guilt. She had saved him from the sheriff, but she had consigned him to this dark underground hole, a place not so different from the prison he had fled. As she lowered the heavy trapdoor back into place, the sound of it settling into its frame felt like the closing of a coffin lid. She carefully repositioned the rug, smoothing it out, erasing any sign of the secret world that lay beneath her feet. The rest of the day was the longest of her life. She forced herself to follow her normal routine, to make her movements seem natural, unhurried. She worked in the garden, weeding and watering, her back to the road, but her ears were straining, listening. She hung laundry on the line, the bright white sheets flapping in the breeze like flags of surrender. Every flutter of a leaf, every distant bird call made her jump. She felt as if she were on a stage, performing the role of an ordinary farm woman for an unseen and hostile audience. She thought about Blevins. He was a creature of the local power structure, a man whose loyalty was not to the law, but to the wealthy landowners and businessmen who ran the county. Men like Judge Patterson, who owned the largest tobacco farm in the region and held the mortgage on half the small properties, including hers. Blevins was Patterson's man, his enforcer. He kept the order that Patterson and his kind depended on, an order that was built on a foundation of fear and racial hierarchy. Caleb was a threat to that order. His very existence as a runaway, a black soldier who had defied a white officer, was an intolerable crack in their carefully maintained world. They wouldn't just be looking for a fugitive, they would be looking to make an example of him, to reinforce the rules, to remind everyone of the consequences of stepping out of line. And now she had stepped out of line with him. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard, she saw the plume of dust. Her heart stopped. It was Blevins again. This time, he was not alone. There was a second man in the car with him. She stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a carefully composed mask of weary welcome as the car crunched to a halt in her yard. Sheriff Blevins got out, but it was the other man who held her attention. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a linen suit, a man whose soft hands and expensive shoes looked wildly out of place on her humble farm. It was Judge Patterson. "Agnes," the judge said, his voice smooth and paternal, a voice she had heard from the pulpit on Sundays, a voice that could be a soothing balm or a chilling threat. "Forgive the intrusion. The sheriff and I were just discussing this unfortunate business with the escaped prisoner. We were concerned for your safety." "That's very kind of you, Judge," Agnes said, her voice steady. "But as I told the sheriff this morning, I'm quite all right. I've seen no one." The judge smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, but Sheriff Blevins tells me he smelled smoke when he was here this morning. You burning something, Agnes?" "My trash," she said, repeating her lie. "The storm made a mess of things." "I see," the judge said, his eyes scanning her property with an owner's gaze. He looked at the barn. "Mind if we have a look around? Just to be thorough. The army is putting a great deal of pressure on us to find this man. It would be embarrassing for the county if he were found found to be hiding under our very noses. It was not a request. She knew that if she refused, it would be an admission of guilt. They would be back with a warrant and a dozen men. "Of course not, Judge," she said, her heart a block of ice in her chest. "Look wherever you like." She stood on the porch, a silent, helpless observer, as the two most powerful men in the county began their search. They started with the barn. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, Blevins poking into the hayloft with a pitchfork, Patterson peering into the empty stalls. Agnes prayed that she had left no sign, no stray thread from his uniform, no drop of blood. Then they came toward the house. "We'll just have a quick look inside, Agnes," the judge said, his smile unwavering. "Just to put our minds at ease." She stepped aside and let them in. They walked through her small, clean house, their presence a violation. Blevins looked in the closets, under the beds. Patterson ran a hand along the dusty mantelpiece, his eyes taking in the photograph of Daniel in his uniform. They were in the kitchen now, standing on the very rug that covered the trapdoor. Agnes held her breath. She could feel Caleb's presence beneath her feet, a silent, terrified vibration. She prayed he would not make a sound, not a cough, not a moan. Blevins kicked at the edge of the rug. "That's a new rug, ain't it, Agnes?" "It's my mother's," she said, her voice thin. "I just brought it out from the attic." The judge looked down at the floor, then at her. His cold, intelligent eyes seemed to see right through her, through the floorboards, into the darkness below. He knew, she was sure of it. He didn't have proof, not yet, but his instincts, honed by a lifetime of maintaining power, were telling him that the crack in his perfect world was right here, in this room, beneath his feet. He smiled again, that terrible, knowing smile. "Well," he said, turning for the door, "everything seems to be in order. Thank you for your time, Agnes. We appreciate your cooperation." He paused at the door. "You know, your husband was a fine man, a hero. He died for the values that make this county, this country great. I'm sure you wouldn't want to do anything to dishonor his memory." The veiled threat hung in the air long after they had gone. They had found nothing, but they had left a clear message. They were watching her. They suspected, and they would be back. She was no longer just hiding a man. She was in a direct personal conflict with the very heart of the power that ruled her world. The departure of Judge Patterson and Sheriff Blevins did not bring relief, only a different, more insidious kind of fear. The immediate threat of discovery had passed, but it had been replaced by the chilling certainty that she was now a marked woman. The judge's final words, the invocation of her husband's memory, had not been a comfort. They had been a weapon, a carefully chosen barb designed to remind her of her place, of the debt of loyalty she was perceived to owe to their world and its values. They hadn't found Caleb, but they had found her. They had located the weak point in the county's social armor, and they would not forget it. Agnes waited until the last trace of their car's dust had settled back onto the road, until the evening air was still and quiet again. Then she moved with a renewed, desperate urgency. She bolted the front and back doors, a futile gesture she knew would do nothing to stop them if they decided to return in force. She drew the curtains in every window, shutting out the dying light of the day, creating a small, self-contained world of shadows and secrets. Her farmhouse, once a place of open doors and welcoming light, had become a fortress under siege. She lifted the trapdoor, her movements now practiced and sure. "They're gone," she called down into the darkness, her voice a strained whisper. A moment later, Caleb's face appeared at the bottom of the steps, pale and ghostly in the lamplight she carried. The relief in his eyes was palpable, but it was mingled with a profound and terrible guilt. "I heard them," he said, as she descended the steps. "I heard everything. He knows, doesn't he? The judge. He suspects," Agnes corrected, though in her heart she felt he was right. "He has no proof, not yet." She set down the lamp and a basket containing a plate of food, a bottle of fresh water, and clean bandages. "We have to be more careful than ever. They'll be watching the road. They might even be watching the house from the woods. You can't come out of here, not for anything. Not until we can figure out a way to get you clear of this county." The logistics of their new reality were a constant, nerve-wracking puzzle. She could only tend to him under the cover of darkness, creeping down into the cellar after the moon had set, her movements as stealthy as a thief's. She changed his bandages, checked his splint, and brought him food and water. His fever had broken, a small mercy, but the break in his leg was a raw, angry thing, and the enforced immobility in the damp, cramped space was a new kind of torture for him. They spoke in whispers, their conversations a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. He told her about his home in Philadelphia, about his mother who worked as a seamstress, about his dream of becoming an architect and building beautiful houses. He was not just a soldier, not just a fugitive. He was a young man with a life, with dreams that had been casually and cruelly derailed. And Agnes, in turn, found herself talking about Daniel, about their life together, about the quiet, simple happiness that had been stolen from her. She spoke of things she had not spoken of to anyone, unlocking rooms in her own heart that had been sealed since the day the telegram arrived. In that dark, subterranean hole, two isolated souls, a black soldier and a white widow, bound together by a shared enemy and a shared sense of injustice, began to forge a bond of profound and unlikely trust. But outside the cellar, the world was closing in. The judge and the sheriff had begun a quiet, systematic campaign of psychological warfare. It started with the mail. Her weekly delivery from the postman, once a source of comfort, a connection to the outside world, suddenly stopped. When she drove into town for supplies, a journey she now made with a knot of dread in her stomach, the postmaster, a man she had known her whole life, would not meet her eye. "Sorry, Agnes," he'd mumbled, shuffling papers. "Ain't nothing here for you." She knew it was a lie. Her letters, her newspaper were being intercepted, another way to increase her isolation, to cut her off. Then came the visits, not from the sheriff, but from neighbors. Mrs. Gable, whose farm was a few miles down the road, appeared one afternoon with a freshly baked apple pie, her face a mask of false sympathy. "Agnes, dear," she'd said, her eyes darting around the kitchen, "we're all so worried about you, all alone out here. It's not right. The judge was saying at the church social he feels a responsibility for our war widows. He thinks perhaps this farm is too much for you to handle on your own." It was a reconnaissance mission, thinly disguised as a neighborly call. Mrs. Gable was reporting back, another set of eyes and ears in the judge's silent army. Agnes accepted the pie with a polite, empty smile and watched from the window as Mrs. Gable drove away, turning not toward her own farm, but in the direction of town. The pressure intensified. One morning, she found one of her cows dead in the field, its neck broken. There were no tracks, no sign of a predator. It was a clean, professional job, an act of calculated cruelty designed to send a message. This is what we can do. We can reach into your life and break the things you care about. When she reported it to the sheriff, he had been dismissive. "Probably coyotes, Agnes," he'd said with a shrug. "You should be more careful." Fear began to eat at her, a constant corrosive acid. She started to lose weight. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. The strain of her double life, the smiling, stoic widow by day, the fearful clandestine nurse by night, was stretching her to the breaking point. She felt a growing paranoia, a sense that she was being watched at all times. She would see a flicker of movement in the woods at the edge of her property and would freeze, her heart pounding, only to realize it was just a deer. The most difficult part was concealing her own fear from Caleb. In the cellar, she tried to be a source of calm and hope, telling him that his leg was mending well, that they would find a way, that they just needed to be patient. But he saw through her facade. He saw the growing tension in her face, the new lines of worry around her eyes. "This is my fault," he said one night, his voice filled with a helpless rage. "They're doing this to you because of me. I should have never come here. I should have just let them take me." "Don't you ever say that?" Agnes snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "What they're doing because it's who they are. They're bullies and tyrants who can't stand the thought of one person, one small act of decency, defying their will. This isn't just about you, Caleb. It's about me now, too. It's about this farm. It's about Daniel's memory. I will not let them win." If Agnes's courage in this moment has moved you, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue to honor souls as resilient as hers. Her words were a declaration of war. She had been pushed too far. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a hard, unyielding anger. They had thought she was weak, a grieving, helpless woman they could easily intimidate. They had misjudged her. They had awakened a strength in her she hadn't known she possessed. The stubborn, resilient strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She knew they could not stay on the farm forever. It was a waiting game, and the judge held all the cards. Sooner or later he would tire of the psychological games and would come for them. She had to find a way to get Caleb out, not just from the county, but from the state, somewhere far to the north where he could truly disappear. But how? The roads were watched. The buses and trains would be impossible. She had no one to turn to, no one she could trust. The entire community had become an extension of the judge's will. The answer, when it came from an unlikely source. It came from the past. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out an old trunk in the attic, she came across a box of Daniel's old army things. In it was a photograph of his platoon from basic training, a group of smiling young men in their new uniforms. And one of the faces was startlingly familiar. It was a young, beardless Sheriff Blevins. Agnes stared at the photograph, a cold, audacious idea beginning to form in her mind. Blevins and Daniel had known each other. They had served together, at least for a time. Did that mean anything? Blevins was the judge's man now, a loyal and cruel enforcer. But once he had been a soldier. He had sworn the same oath Daniel had sworn. He had been one of the boys. It was a desperate, almost suicidal long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She had to find a crack in the wall that surrounded her, a chink in the armor of the judge's power. And that chink, just possibly, might be the ghost of the young, idealistic soldier that Sheriff Blevins had once been. She put the photograph in her apron pocket. She had a new plan. She was done waiting. She was done being the victim. She was going to take the fight to them, not with a weapon, but with a memory. She was going to confront the sheriff, not as a defiant criminal, but as the widow of his fallen comrade. And she would pray that somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of corruption and cruelty, there was still a spark of the man he used to be. The decision to confront Sheriff Blevins was the single most terrifying choice Agnes had made since pulling Caleb from the barn. It felt like walking willingly into a wolf's den, armed with nothing but a faded photograph and a fragile hope. For 2 days, she wrestled with the plan, the risks replaying in her mind in an endless, horrifying loop. If she was wrong, if there was no flicker of the old soldier left in Blevins, she would be handing him the very proof he needed. Her visit would be a confession, a final, fatal mistake that would doom both her and Caleb. But the alternative, to do nothing, to wait in her besieged farmhouse for the inevitable, was a slower, more certain kind of death. The judge's campaign of intimidation was working. Her supplies were running low, and each trip to town was a fresh ordeal of hostile stares and whispered insults. Her cow, her only source of small income, was gone. Her isolation was nearly absolute. She knew that Patterson was patient. He would let her wither on the vine, let the fear and the loneliness and the poverty do his work for him, until she was so broken that she would surrender without a fight. She could not let that happen. Her anger, her stubborn refusal to be broken, was the only weapon she had left. On the 3rd day, she made her move. She told Caleb her plan, speaking to him through the crack in the trapdoor. He was dead set against it. "It's too dangerous, Agnes," he pleaded, his voice a low, urgent whisper from the darkness. "He's not a soldier anymore. He's a lawman. His loyalty is to them, not to the memory of your husband. He'll arrest you on the spot." "No, and what if he does?" she countered, her voice hard with a resolve that surprised even herself. "What if they arrest me and find you? We're no worse off than we will be in a week or a month. This is not a life, Caleb. It's a slow execution. I have to try something. I have to believe there is still a decent man somewhere inside that uniform." She left him with a fresh supply of water and the last of her canned stew, her heart aching at the fear in his eyes. She dressed carefully, not in her work clothes, but in her best Sunday dress, the one she had worn to Daniel's memorial service. She combed her hair and pinned it neatly, a small act of reclaiming her dignity, of presenting herself not as a frightened farm woman, but as Mrs. Daniel Miller, a respectable war widow. She placed the photograph in her purse, its sharp corners a constant, solid reminder of her mission. The drive into town was a journey through enemy territory. She felt as though the very trees were watching her. When she pulled her old truck up in front of the sheriff's office, a small, grim brick building next to the courthouse, her hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. She walked inside. The office was a spare, masculine space that smelled of stale cigar smoke and floor polish. A young deputy, a boy she didn't recognize, looked up from his desk, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Sheriff Blevins was in his private office at the back, the door ajar. He was on the telephone, his back to her. "I'm here to see the sheriff," Agnes said to the deputy, her voice clear and firm. The deputy looked flustered. "He's busy right now, ma'am. You'll have to wait." "I'll wait in his office," Agnes said, and before the young man could protest, she walked past him and pushed the door to Blevins' office wide open. Blevins turned, his thick face registering surprise, then annoyance. He was speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone into the phone. "Yeah, the pressure's working. Another week or two she'll crack. I'll call you back." He hung up the phone abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. He knew exactly who had been on the other end of that line. Judge Patterson. She had walked right into the middle of their conspiracy. "Agnes," he said, his folksy drawl gone, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "This is a private office. You have no business barging in here." "We need to talk, Sheriff," she said, her voice not wavering. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the gawking deputy. "I have nothing to say to you," he said, gesturing for her to leave. "But I have something to show you," she said. She walked to his desk and took the photograph from her purse, placing it squarely in the middle of his cluttered blotter. "Do you remember him?" Blevins stared at the photograph. He saw the group of young, smiling faces, the crisp, new uniforms, the boundless, naive optimism of boys on the brink of an adventure they couldn't possibly comprehend. And he saw himself, a younger, thinner man, his arms slung around the shoulder of another boy, a boy with a wide, infectious grin. Daniel Miller. For a long, silent moment, the sheriff did not move. He simply looked at the image, and a flicker of some long-forgotten emotion crossed his heavy features. It was not nostalgia, not exactly. It was something more complex, more painful. It was the ghost of a man he had once been. "I remember him," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the photograph. "He wrote to me about you," Agnes said, pressing her advantage, her voice soft now, not accusatory. "He said you were the best shot in the platoon. He said you saved his skin during a training exercise, pulled him out of a ravine when he broke his ankle. He said you were a good man, Bill." Using his first name was another gamble. It was an attempt to peel back the uniform, the badge, the years of compromise and cruelty, and speak to the man underneath. Blevins finally looked up at her, and his eyes were filled with a deep, weary anger. "What do you want, Agnes?" "I want you to remember the oath you took," she said, her voice rising with a quiet, passionate intensity. "The same oath Daniel took, an oath to defend this country and its ideals, not to be the errand boy for a tyrant like Judge Patterson. What you are doing to me, to my farm, it's not the law, it's a shakedown, it's a betrayal of everything Daniel died for." "Daniel died for his country," Blevins snarled, a flush rising in his neck. "He didn't die to protect some runaway colored boy who assaulted an officer. He died for a country that is supposed to believe in justice," she shot back. "And that boy in my house is a soldier, just like you were, just like Daniel was. He was wronged. He was framed, and he deserves the same justice you would have demanded for yourself, for Daniel." Blevins stood up, his massive frame seeming to fill the small office. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from hers. "You are playing a very dangerous game," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You have admitted to harboring a fugitive. I could arrest you right now. I should arrest you right now." "Then do it," Agnes said, her gaze unflinching. She did not back away. "Arrest me, tear my house apart, drag that wounded boy out and let the judge have his victory. But you will have to look at this photograph every single day for the rest of your life. You will have to remember the man who called you a friend, the man whose wife you destroyed, because you were too much of a coward to stand up to a bully. You think the judge is powerful? Try living with that kind of ghost for the rest of your days." Her words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a curse. She had laid all her cards on the table. She had nothing left. She could only wait and see what he would do. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working, a silent, furious battle waging behind his eyes. She could see the conflict, the man he was versus the man he had once promised to be. She saw the years of small compromises, of looking the other way, of slowly trading his soul for a position of petty power. And she saw the flicker, the tiny, almost imperceptible spark of shame. He finally broke the gaze, turning away from her and walking to the window, his back to her. He stared out at the quiet town square, at the courthouse, at the symbols of the power he served. "Get out of my office, Agnes," he said, his voice a rough, choked whisper. Her heart sank. She had failed. He was sending her away. He was going to call the judge. "Get out," he repeated, still not turning around. "Go home, and if you have any trash that needs hauling away, I'd suggest you do it tonight. The judge is hosting his annual poker game. He and his friends will be busy until dawn. The roads will be quiet, especially the old logging road that leads up over the mountain. It comes out on the other side of the state line. No one's used it in years, but I hear it's still passable." Agnes stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a map. It was a plan. It was a window of opportunity, a single narrow path to freedom, offered by the very man she had thought was her jailer. He still had not turned around. "Now go," he said, his voice raw, "before I change my mind." Agnes backed out of the office, her legs unsteady. She walked past the confused deputy without a word, out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She did not know if it was a trick. She did not know if he would be waiting for them on that old logging road, but it was the only chance they had. She had appealed to the ghost of a soldier, and somewhere in the darkness of Bill Blevins's soul, that ghost had answered. The drive back to the farm was a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Agnes's mind raced, replaying the scene in the sheriff's office over and over, dissecting every word, every nuance of his tone. Was it a trap? It was the most logical conclusion. Blevins was Patterson's man, through and through. This sudden, cryptic act of assistance could easily be a ruse, a way to lure them out into the open, to catch them red-handed in the act of escaping. The old logging road could be the perfect place for an ambush, a deserted, isolated spot where anything could happen, with no witnesses. Yet there had been something in his voice, in his refusal to meet her eye, that felt genuine. It wasn't the voice of a man setting a trap. It was the voice of a man in conflict, a man deeply ashamed. She had reached him, not with a threat, but with a memory. The photograph of Daniel had been a key, unlocking a part of him that had been dormant for years, a part that still remembered a different code of honor. She was staking their lives on the fragile hope that this flicker of his former self was real. As soon as she reached the farmhouse, she went to the cellar. "We're leaving," she said, her voice a low, urgent command down the dark stairwell. "Tonight." She explained the conversation with Blevins, the judge's poker game, the instructions for the logging road. Caleb listened in silence, his face a mixture of hope and the same deep suspicion she felt. "It could be a trap, Agnes," he said, echoing her own fears. "I know," she replied. "It's a terrible risk, but it's the only one we have. Staying here is not a risk, it's a certainty. They will find you. It's only a matter of when." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I trust my gut, and my gut tells me he was telling the truth. For Daniel's sake." The hours leading up to their departure were a frenzy of controlled, silent activity. Their window of opportunity was small and precise. After midnight, when the judge's party would be in full swing, and before dawn, when the first farmers would be on the roads. Their first and greatest challenge was Caleb. His leg, though beginning to mend, was still a huge liability. He could not walk or even stand for more than a few moments. Getting him out of the cellar and into her truck would be a slow, painful, and dangerously noisy process. Agnes was a farmer. She knew how to solve practical problems. She found a sturdy wooden chair and a length of thick rope from the barn. Working together in the cramped cellar, they strapped his broken leg to the side of the chair, immobilizing it. Then came the Herculean task of getting him up the stairs. Agnes, her body straining with a strength born of desperation, pulled from the top while Caleb pushed with his good leg and his arms, his face contorted in a silent scream of pain. It was a brutal, agonizing process, every scrape of the chair on the wooden steps sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. But they did it. They got him into the kitchen, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. She gave him a large dose of the whiskey, not for pleasure, but as a crude anesthetic. The next part would be even worse. She backed her old Ford truck as close to the kitchen door as she could, leaving the engine off. She laid a thick pile of blankets and empty grain sacks in the truck bed, creating a makeshift nest. Then, using the same agonizing combination of pulling, pushing, and lifting, they maneuvered him out of the house and into the back of the truck, arranging him so he was lying flat, as comfortable as possible. Finally, she covered him with a heavy canvas tarp, just as her father had done for them what felt like a lifetime ago. He was a hidden, vulnerable piece of cargo. She did one last sweep of the house, her heart aching. She was leaving everything behind: the house her grandfather had built, the land her family had worked, the last tangible connections to her life with Daniel. She packed a single small bag with the few things that truly mattered: the photograph of Daniel and Blevins, a small bundle of Daniel's letters, the last of her mother's money, and a loaf of bread. She left the kerosene lamp burning on the kitchen table, a small beacon of normalcy for anyone who might be watching. She did not lock the door. There was nothing left to protect. At midnight, she climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a loud, complaining groan that made her heart leap into her throat, but it caught. She backed slowly out of the yard, her headlights off, navigating by the faint light of a sliver of moon. The journey was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl through a familiar landscape that had become alien and menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep. She drove with an intense, focused concentration, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She found the turn-off for the old logging road exactly where Blevins had said it would be, a nearly invisible break in the trees, overgrown with weeds. The road itself was little more than two deep ruts carved into the mountainside, a treacherous path of mud and rock. The truck bounced and lurched, the chassis groaning in protest. In the back, she could hear Caleb's muffled gasps of pain with every jarring bump. The road climbed steeply into the dark, silent heart of the mountains. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches clawing at the truck, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of darkness. This was it. If Blevins had set a trap, this was the place it would be sprung. At every switchback, every blind curve, she expected to see the sudden, blinding glare of headlights, to hear the shouted command to halt. Her entire body was a single, coiled spring of tension. But there was nothing, only the sound of their own laboring engine, the chirping of insects, and the vast, indifferent silence of the forest. They passed the crest of the mountain, and the road began its long, treacherous descent down the other side. Agnes felt a small, fragile spark of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, he had been telling the truth. They reached the bottom of the mountain, just as the first hint of grey was touching the eastern sky. The logging road spilled out onto a paved two-lane highway. A signpost, riddled with bullet holes, read, "West Virginia State Line, 1 mile." They had made it. They had crossed over. Agnes pulled the truck over to the side of the road and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. For a moment, she just sat there, her head resting against the steering wheel, her body trembling with the release of a tension so profound she hadn't realized how heavily it had been weighing on her. She got out and went to the back of the truck, pulling back the tarp. Caleb was pale and exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and grime, but his eyes were open, and they were shining with a light she had not seen before. It was the light of freedom. "You did it, Agnes," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, reverent awe. "You got us out. We got us out," she corrected, a weary but triumphant smile touching her lips. She helped him sit up and gave him a long drink of water. As they sat there, in the cool, misty air of the dawning day, a new reality began to sink in. They were free from Oakhaven County, free from the immediate threat of the judge and the sheriff, but they were also adrift. They were in a new state, with no money, no connections, and a future that was as uncertain as it had been the day they had first met. They had won the battle, but the war for their survival was far from over. "What now?" Caleb asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Agnes looked north, down the long, empty stretch of highway that disappeared into the morning mist. She had no answer. She had no plan beyond this moment, beyond this one desperate act of escape. Her entire world had been focused on this single goal for so long that she had not allowed herself to think past it. "I guess," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed, "we keep going north, and we find a place where a person's worth isn't measured by the color of their skin or the name of their husband, a place where we can build something new." She looked at him, her smile widening. "You wanted to build beautiful houses, right? Let's go find a place to build one." He smiled back, a genuine, hopeful smile that transformed his tired face. For the first time, they were not a widow and a fugitive, a white woman and a black man. They were just two people, two survivors, partners in a dangerous and uncertain enterprise, facing a new day together. Agnes climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway, driving toward a future she could not see, but one she was, for the first time, choosing for herself. The road north was not a path to an immediate, promised land, but a slow, arduous crawl through a landscape of poverty and suspicion. West Virginia and then Pennsylvania were not the havens of enlightenment Agnes had naively hoped for. The brand of prejudice was different here, less overt perhaps than the suffocating systemic racism of Oakhaven County, but it was a constant, grinding presence nonetheless. It was in the cold stares of gas station attendants, the sudden silence in a diner when they walked in together, the no vacancy signs that miraculously appeared at boarding houses when the proprietor saw them both. The unwritten laws they had fled had long invisible borders. Their meager supply of money, the last of Daniel's army pay and her mother's savings, dwindled with terrifying speed. Every dollar was spent on gasoline for the truck, or a loaf of bread, and a block of cheese that would serve as their meals for the day. They slept in the truck, pulled over in deserted groves of trees or the anonymous parking lots of shuttered factories. Agnes would take the cab, while Caleb, his legs still a source of constant throbbing pain, would lie in the back, the hard metal bed, a poor substitute for a mattress. The nights were cold, and the days were a monotonous cycle of driving, searching for a place to rest, and facing the quiet, persistent hostility of the world. Agnes drove with a grim, relentless determination. The truck, her last tangible link to her old life, became their ark, their fortress, their entire world. It chugged and wheezed its way over the Appalachian Mountains, the engine protesting on every steep incline. She learned the machine's quirks, the feel of its engine, the sound of its complaints. It was a stubborn, reliable old beast, much like herself. Caleb, confined to the back of the truck, was a frustrated, helpless passenger. The man of action, the soldier, was forced into a state of total dependency, and it ate at him. He watched Agnes, saw the growing exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders slumped a little more each day, and the guilt he felt was a physical weight. "This isn't right, Agnes," he said one evening as they shared a meager meal of crackers and water on the side of a deserted road. "You've lost everything because of me. Your home, your farm. You're living like a vagrant. You should leave me. Drop me off in the next city. I can fend for myself. You can go and build a new life for yourself, a proper life." Agnes stopped eating and looked at him, her expression hard. "Listen to me, Caleb Freeman," she said, her voice low and fierce. "We are not having this conversation again. The life I had was no life at all. It was an ending. I was just waiting to die. You were a beginning. I chose this. I chose us. So you can stop talking about being a burden. We are partners in this. We sink or we swim together. Now eat your crackers." Her words, harsh as they were were a balm to his wounded pride. She was not his savior, she was his partner. He fell silent, his heart filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. He was in the presence of a courage he had never known, a quiet, stubborn courage that was, in its own way, more formidable than anything he had seen on a battlefield. They pushed on, their sights set on the industrial cities of the North, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit. Places they had heard were so vast and hungry for labor that a man's past and the color of his skin might not matter as much. It was in a small, grimy steel town just south of Pittsburgh that their journey came to an abrupt, grinding halt. The truck's engine, which had been complaining for days, finally gave up. It died with a final shuddering cough and a plume of black smoke, leaving them stranded on the shoulder of a busy highway. Agnes, who had coaxed and cursed the old machine for 1,000 miles, knew with a sinking finality that this was the end of the road. The cost of a new engine, or even a major repair, was far beyond their means. Their ark had sunk. They were truly destitute now, stranded in a place where they knew no one, with less than $5 to their names. They spent the night in the dead truck, the roar of passing traffic a constant mocking reminder of their immobility. The next morning, Agnes sold the truck to a junkman for $20, a fraction of its worth. It felt like selling the last piece of her old life, the last piece of Daniel. As she watched it being towed away, a rusted, pathetic shell, a wave of despair so complete it was nauseating washed over her. "What do we do now?" she whispered, staring at the empty space on the side of the road. "Now," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly firm, "we walk." His leg, though still weak and stiff, had mended enough that he could walk with the aid of a heavy branch he used as a crutch. Their progress was painfully slow. They hobbled into the town, a bleak landscape of blast furnaces, slag heaps, and rows of identical soot-stained company houses. The air tasted of coal smoke and metal. It was here, at their absolute lowest point, that they found a flicker of grace. They found it in a church, a small storefront mission run by a fiery, white-haired preacher named Reverend John. The mission served a free meal every evening to the town's poor and displaced, a thin but hot stew that tasted to Agnes and Caleb like the finest meal they had ever eaten. Reverend John was a man who had seen every kind of human misery. He listened to a shortened, edited version of their story, a widow and a wounded veteran heading north to find work and a new life, and he did not ask the questions that were surely on his mind. He simply saw two people in desperate need. "The Lord provides, but he expects a willing hand," the preacher said, his eyes sharp but kind. "The mission has a small apartment upstairs, just a couple of rooms. It's not much, but it's clean and it's warm. The last fellow who was staying there, he ran off. I need a custodian, someone to sweep the floors, keep the boiler fed, and my wife could use some help in the kitchen. It doesn't pay much, but it comes with the room and 2 meals a day." He looked from Agnes to Caleb. "The work is hard, but it's honest." It was a lifeline, a chance to stop running, to put a roof over their heads, to earn their keep. They accepted with a gratitude so profound that they could barely speak. The work was, as the Reverend had promised, hard. The days were long and grueling. Caleb, despite his leg, insisted on doing the heavy work, his powerful shoulders and stubborn pride compensating for his injury. He swept the mission hall, scrubbed the floors, and hauled buckets of coal for the ancient groaning boiler in the basement. Agnes worked alongside the preacher's wife, a quiet, bird-like woman named Sarah, peeling potatoes, stirring vast pots of soup, and serving the long, silent line of broken men who came to their door each evening. They were a curiosity in the small, tight-knit community of the mission. Agnes, the quiet, well-spoken white woman, and Caleb, the handsome, limping black man. They were a violation of the natural order of things, and they endured their share of stares and whispers. But the raw, unvarnished hardship of the mission had a way of stripping away the pettier forms of prejudice. The men who came for the free stew were too consumed by their own hunger and despair to care much about the color of the hands that were feeding them. In the small, bare apartment above the mission, Agnes and Caleb began for the first time to build a life. It was a life of shared exhaustion and quiet companionship. They would return to their rooms late each evening, their bodies aching, and sit in a comfortable, weary silence. They were too tired for grand pronouncements of love, too scarred by their journey for easy romance. Their bond was forged in something deeper, in shared survival, in a profound and unspoken understanding of the wounds, both visible and invisible, that the world had inflicted on them. Slowly, signs of normalcy began to appear. Caleb's limp lessened. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. He had a purpose again. He was working, providing, protecting. He started to sketch in the evenings, using scraps of paper and a pencil stub, his old dream of being an architect re-emerging from the wreckage of his past. He drew small, beautiful houses filled with light and open spaces. Agnes, too, began to heal. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to loosen its grip. She found a quiet satisfaction in the simple, necessary work of feeding the hungry. She was no longer a victim, no longer a fugitive. She was a woman who had found a new purpose in the service of others. The ghost of Daniel, which had been a source of pain and obligation, slowly transformed into a gentle, comforting memory. She was honoring him not by clinging to the past, but by building a new future, a future he would have been proud of. One evening, months after they had arrived, Caleb showed her a drawing he had been working on for weeks. It was a detailed, lovingly rendered sketch of a small farmhouse with a wide front porch and a sturdy stone chimney. It was not a grand mansion. It was a simple, elegant, and practical home. It looked strong, rooted in the earth, a place of safety and peace. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "It's for you," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the drawing. "It's for us. Someday, when I've cleared my name, when I'm a free man, I'm going to build this for you, for us." It was the first time he had ever spoken of a future that explicitly, a future that was not about running or hiding, but about building and belonging. It was a promise, more real and more powerful than any spoken vow. It was a blueprint for a life she had never dared to imagine. And as she looked at the drawing, at the house that existed only on a piece of paper, she knew with an absolute certainty that she was finally home. The mission became their world, a small island of purpose in the vast, turbulent sea of industrial America. The rhythms of their life were dictated by the ringing of the mission bell, the daily arrival of the hungry, and the endless, cyclical tasks of cleaning and cooking. They had found a fragile peace, a respite from the storm. But both Agnes and Caleb knew it was not a destination, it was a way station. The unresolved question of his past, the brand of fugitive that still unofficially marked him, was a shadow that lay over their quiet, hard-working existence. Caleb had not forgotten his promise to himself. In the precious few hours of quiet he had each week, he did not rest. He began the painstaking, arduous process of fighting for his name. The mission had a small, dusty library of donated books, and among them, miraculously, were a few old law texts. He spent his nights at the kitchen table in their small apartment, under the dim light of a single bulb, poring over the dense, arcane language of military justice. He was like a man trying to decipher a map written in a foreign tongue, but his determination was absolute. He began to write letters. Guided by the memory of the old lawyer he had met in Leavenworth, he wrote to the NAACP, to the American Civil Liberties Union, and to a small but dedicated group of lawyers in Washington, D.C., who specialized in military injustice cases. His letters were not pleas for pity. They were meticulously detailed, factual accounts of his case, outlining the history of the officer's prejudice, the specific events of the confrontation, and the procedural irregularities of his court-martial. He wrote with a clarity and intelligence that impressed even Agnes, who typed each letter for him on Reverend John's ancient, clattering typewriter. The process was slow and disheartening. Most of their letters went unanswered. A few replies trickled in, polite but firm rejections from organizations that were overwhelmed with cases far more high-profile than that of a lone, escaped corporal. It felt like shouting into a void. For every step forward he took, the vast, impersonal bureaucracy of the army seemed to be 1,000 miles ahead. But Caleb refused to be discouraged. "It's like chopping down a big tree with a small axe," he told Agnes one night after another disappointing letter had arrived. You don't see the progress with every swing, but you just have to keep swinging. Eventually the tree will fall. His quiet, relentless persistence was a source of constant awe for Agnes. He was fighting a war on a new front, a war of paper and ink, and he was doing it with the same disciplined courage he must have possessed as a soldier. Her love for him, which had been born in a moment of shared crisis, deepened into a profound and abiding respect. She was no longer just his partner in survival. She was his partner in his quest for justice, his chief of staff, his unwavering believer. Their life at the mission continued for nearly a year. They became fixtures, a part of the small, struggling community. Reverend John and his wife Sarah came to rely on them completely, treating them less as employees and more as family. They never spoke of the true nature of their relationship, but there was a quiet, accepting understanding. They saw two good, hard-working people who had found solace in each other, and in their world, that was enough. The first breakthrough came in the form of a letter from a lawyer in Washington named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a black man, a veteran of the First World War, who had dedicated his life to fighting for the rights of colored soldiers. He was old, semi-retired, and worked out of a cramped, dusty office, but he had a reputation as a tenacious, brilliant legal mind. He had been a friend of the lawyer Caleb had met in Leavenworth. Thorne's letter was different. It was not a rejection. It was cautious, filled with warnings about the difficulty of the case and the slim chances of success, but it contained a spark of interest. Your account of the events is compelling, Corporal Freeman, he wrote. The actions of your commanding officer, if they can be proven, represent a clear violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The key, of course, is proof. Your word against a white officer's is, as you know, not a fair fight in any court, military or civilian. We need corroboration. We need a witness. A witness. The words seemed to hang in the air of their small apartment. In Caleb's mind, the faces of the other men in his unit appeared. The men who had seen the harassment, who had heard the insults, who had been present at the final confrontation, but they had all been too afraid to speak up at the time. To testify against a white officer would have been career suicide, or worse. To find one of them now, a year later, and convince him to speak the truth seemed an impossible task. I remember their names, Caleb said, his voice a low, determined rumble. Henderson, Brooks, a young private from Alabama named Marcus. And so, a new phase of their fight began. They used the last of their meager savings to buy stamps and paper. Caleb began to write a new set of letters, not to lawyers, but to his old comrades. He didn't know where they were stationed now, or if they had even stayed in the army. He sent the letters to their last known unit, hoping against hope that the army's mail system would forward them. The waiting was a new kind of torture. Weeks turned into months. The silence that met their new volley of letters was deafening. Agnes watched Caleb, saw the hope in his eyes begin to flicker again, and her heart ached for him. She began to fear that they had reached a dead end, that the wall of fear and silence was too high to climb. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Detroit. The return address was just a name, PFC Marcus Cole. Caleb's hands trembled as he opened it. The letter inside was short, written on a piece of greasy paper in a barely literate scrawl. Corporal Freeman, I got your letter. I'm out of the army now, working at the Ford plant here. I remember that day. I remember what that lieutenant did. It wasn't right. I was scared to say anything then. I was just a kid. I'm not a kid anymore. If it'll help you clear your name, I'll tell them what I saw. I ain't scared of them no more. Your brother, Marcus Cole Caleb, read the letter aloud, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost holy. It was more than a confirmation of his story. It was a validation of his faith in his fellow soldiers. Marcus, the young, frightened private, had found his courage. He had become a man. The letter from Marcus was the key that unlocked everything. With a sworn, notarized affidavit from a witness, Elias Thorne was able to officially petition the army for a review of Caleb's court-martial. The wheels of military justice which had been frozen for so long, began to grind slowly, ponderously into motion. The process was still agonizingly slow. It was a war of attrition, fought through a series of letters, motions, and petitions between Thorne in Washington and the Army's legal bureaucracy. Months passed. The seasons changed, but for the first time, Agnes and Caleb were not just waiting in the dark. They were waiting for a verdict. Their future was no longer a vague, undefined hope. It was a specific event they were moving toward. During this long period of waiting, their life took on a new, more settled quality. Caleb, his name now in the system as part of a legal appeal, was able to get a proper job. He found work at a small construction company run by a sympathetic Polish immigrant who cared more about a man's ability to work hard than about the color of his skin or his past. For the first time, Caleb was doing the work he was born to do, learning the trades of carpentry and masonry. His architect's mind finally connected to the real-world work of building. They were able to move out of the small mission apartment and into a modest but clean two-room flat of their own. It was the first real home they had ever had together. Agnes found part-time work as a seamstress, putting to use the skills she had learned at her mother's side. They were not rich, but they were no longer destitute. They were building a life, brick by brick, just as Caleb had promised. Their relationship, which had been forged in crisis and tempered in hardship, now settled into a deep, quiet, and unshakable love. They were no longer running. They were standing their ground, waiting for the world to catch up with the truth. Finally, after nearly 2 years of waiting, a thick official envelope arrived from Washington. It was addressed to Corporal Caleb Freeman. Agnes saw it in the mailbox when she came home from work. She took it upstairs, her heart pounding. She placed it in the center of their small kitchen table and waited for Caleb to come home. He saw it the moment he walked in the door. He stood for a long moment just looking at it, the dust from the construction site still on his clothes. Then he sat down at the table. With a steady hand, he picked up the envelope, tore it open, and began to read. Agnes watched his face, searching for a sign. Her own breath held in her chest. His expression did not change. He read the entire document, a full page of dense legal text, in a profound and unnerving silence. When he finished, he placed the paper gently on the table. He looked up at her, and his eyes were shining. "They've overturned the conviction," he said, his voice a quiet whisper of disbelief. "They've issued a formal apology and an honorable discharge." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the breath of a man who had been underwater for a very long time and had just broken the surface. "It's over, Agnes. I'm a free man." The news of Caleb's exoneration did not arrive in their small apartment like a thunderclap, but like the slow, quiet breaking of a dawn after a long and starless night. For a full minute after he spoke the words, "I'm a free man," neither of them moved. They simply sat at their kitchen table, the official document from the army lying between them like a sacred text, and let the truth of it sink into the marrow of their bones. The weight they had been carrying for so long, a burden of injustice, fear, and uncertainty, was finally, miraculously lifted. The first thing Caleb did was not shout for joy or weep with relief. He reached across the table and took Agnes's hands in his. His hands were rough and calloused from his work, but his touch was gentle. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was deeper than mere happiness. "We are free." In that single word, he acknowledged the truth of their journey. This had not been his fight alone. It had been their fight. His name was the one on the paper, but her courage was the ink it was written in. She had lost her home, her past, and her safety for him. She had faced down the most powerful men in her world for him. She had been his nurse, his strategist, his confidant, and his unwavering source of strength. His victory was her victory. Tears finally came to Agnes's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound and overwhelming release. "What do we do now?" she whispered. The question that had haunted them at every desperate turn of their journey now presented in a new and wonderful light. It was no longer a question of survival, but of choice. "Now," Caleb said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face, a smile she had not seen in its full, unburdened glory since the day they met. We start building. Their life, which had been on hold for so long, suddenly lurched into forward motion. The honorable discharge was more than just a piece of paper. It was a key. It opened doors that had been rusted shut. With his name cleared and his military service officially recognized, Caleb was eligible for the GI Bill, a benefit he had never dreamed he would be able to access. It was a lifeline, a ladder out of the world of day labor and into the world of his dreams. He enrolled in night classes at a technical college, studying drafting and architectural design. The man who had taught himself the law from discarded books now attacked his new studies with a fierce, joyful intensity. He was a sponge, soaking up knowledge, his mind finally free to focus on creating rather than just surviving. During the day, he continued to work in construction, but he was no longer just a laborer. He was an apprentice, learning every aspect of the building trade from the ground up, his practical skills catching up with his theoretical knowledge. Agnes, too, found a new sense of purpose. She continued her work as a seamstress, but she also volunteered at the mission, unable to completely sever her ties to the place that had been their first true sanctuary. She helped Sarah in the kitchen, her quiet, compassionate presence a comfort to the endless stream of men who, like Caleb, were fighting their own desperate battles. She had found a calling in the simple, profound act of offering a hand to those who had fallen. They saved every penny they could. They lived frugally, their small apartment a haven of shared dreams and quiet contentment. On the wall above their kitchen table, Caleb pinned the drawing of the farmhouse he had made for her, the blueprint of their future. It was a constant, tangible reminder of their goal. After 2 years of relentless work and study, Caleb graduated. He had a degree, a set of skills, and a reputation as one of the hardest working, most honest builders in the city. He took the biggest leap of faith of his life. He used the small amount of money they had saved, along with a modest loan from the GI Bill, and bought a small, neglected plot of land on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, a scrubby, overgrown lot on a forgotten street, but it was theirs. And then he began to build. He built the house from his drawing, the house that had been born in the despair of their early days and had sustained them through the long years of struggle. He built it with his own 2 hands. Agnes worked alongside him on the weekends, hammering nails, sanding wood, her own hands growing calloused and strong. They were not just building a structure of wood and stone, they were building the physical manifestation of their love and their resilience. The house rose slowly from the earth, a testament to their shared will. It was a simple, beautiful thing, with a wide front porch for watching the sunset and a sturdy stone chimney that promised warmth against the winter cold. It was a house built on a foundation of impossible odds and unbreakable promises. The day they moved in, nearly 5 years after Agnes had found him broken and bleeding in her barn, was a day of quiet, profound triumph. The house was empty, containing only a bed, a table, and 2 chairs, but it was filled with a sense of peace and permanence that was more valuable than any possession. That evening, they stood on their new front porch, watching the last of the summer sun dip below the horizon. "Do you ever think about them?" Agnes asked softly. "Judge Patterson? The sheriff?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, looking out at the small patch of land that was theirs. "Sometimes," he said finally. "I don't feel anger anymore. I almost feel pity. They live in a prison of their own making, a world built on fear and hate. They thought they had all the power, but a man who has to rule by fear has no real power at all. All they can do is break things. They can't build anything beautiful, not like this." He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "We won, Agnes. Not because we beat them, but because we outlasted them. We built a life they couldn't even imagine." A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Oakhaven County. Agnes's heart gave a familiar lurch of fear. before she saw the return address. It was from her mother. It was the first word she had received from her family in 5 years. Her hands trembled as she read it. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky. Her father had passed away a year ago, his heart finally giving out. The bank, Patterson's bank, had foreclosed on the store and the farm shortly after. Her mother was now living with a cousin in a nearby town, but the letter was not filled with recrimination. It was filled with a quiet, weary regret. I hope this letter finds you and that you are well. I have thought of you every day. Your father spoke of you often before he passed. He was proud of you. He said you had a strength he had lost. I was wrong to want a safe life for you, if it was not also a true one. I pray you have found a true one. Tucked inside the letter was a small faded newspaper clipping. It was an obituary, but it was not for her father. It was for Sheriff Bill Blevins. He had died of a heart attack 2 months ago. He was only 48 years old. According to the obituary, he had been a decorated veteran and a dedicated public servant. There was no mention of the demons that had haunted him, of the conflict that had raged within his soul. There was only the neat, clean lie of a small-town newspaper. Agnes showed the letter to Caleb. He read it in silence, his expression thoughtful. "He gave us a chance," Caleb said softly. "In the end, he did the right thing. I hope he found some peace." Agnes knew then that their story had finally, truly come full circle. The ghosts of Oakhaven County had been laid to rest. Their power over her was broken, replaced not by hatred, but by a sad, compassionate understanding. That fall, in the small, simple living room of the house they had built together, with Reverend John officiating and Sarah and a few friends from the mission as witnesses, Agnes Miller and Caleb Freeman were married. Agnes did not wear a fancy dress, just a simple blue one. Caleb did not wear a suit, just his clean work clothes. There were no lilies, no organ music, but there was a quiet, unshakable joy, a joy that had been earned through years of shared struggle and unwavering love. After the ceremony, Agnes went to her desk and wrote a letter. She addressed it to a boarding house on the south side of Chicago. She told Hattie all about her new life, about her new husband, about the house they had built, and tucked inside the envelope was a small photograph, a picture of her and Caleb standing on the front porch of their home, their arms around each other, their faces turned toward the future. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these powerful memories will never be extinguished. Thank you.